spark some interest in that.
We had Shakespeare in Love way back when. That won an Oscar too.
I don't know. I don't recall that movie. Shakespeare in Love.
Oh, that's
Oh, that
great.
actually, that was
Won Best Picture.
best picture. It beat out, there was a little bit of controversy because the favorite was Saving Private Ryan. It just
Oh,
beat
yes,
out.
that's right, that was that year.
That's right.
It was a good movie. It probably didn't deserve that,
Well,
but it was good. It was good.
That wasn't too long ago then, maybe 10 years.
Came in.
Yeah.
as I said.
Yeah.
Was that it was a late 90s movie, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
We had a trivia question for the night.
I know. I feel I was in middle school when that came out.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Well, it could be, because the time goes by, you know, we don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I have little kids now, and they're 1 kids.
Yeah.
And several months later. Well, before we get started, my name is Matt Bose. I'm the assistant director here at the library. Thank you for coming out, and welcome to the library. We do have some other great events coming up, so there are bookmarks on the table over here. Actually, in a couple weeks, we have a living history event through the New Hampshire Humanities, and Sally Matson will be here. She'll be reenacting Margaret Bork White. Has anyone heard of her? Yep, very famous photojournalist. She was the first one in 1930 to go and photograph the Soviet industry, and then she was the first female photo war journalist. So she'll have a fascinating life, and that should be a really interesting event. It's co-sponsored with the Historical Society. So grab a flyer, and hopefully we'll see you back here then. And of course, a big reason of why we organized tonight is that the first folio is going to be on exhibit at the Currier Museum of Art, April 9th to May 1st, and that's on loan from the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. You can actually go and see it for free during that time, but to get into the rest of the museum, you would have to pay, but you can use the library's museum pass. So call up before you're going to make a visit and reserve our pass, and you can enjoy the whole museum and see the first folio.
So if you get the pass from the library, it's free at the Currier, or is it an additional admission?
Yeah, it's you can go and see the first folio for free. Anyone can go during that time that it's here. But to enjoy the rest of the museum and the other exhibits, you'd have to pay, I believe. And that's what you can use our pass for.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, as a library member, you can borrow that and you can get in for free.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. That brings us to our presenter tonight. We have with us Mike Glaeser. He's an adjunct professor at UNH Manchester. He also teaches at SNHU. And this is his area of expertise. And he'll be talking to us about the Wars of the Roses and how Shakespeare's histories, what the truth and myths are in those. So welcome, Mike, and thank you so much for being here. I'll turn things over to you.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I do appreciate you guys coming. As I said, when the first person walked in, I'm glad I'm not talking to myself. Always a benefit and a plus. So what Matt said is correct. My area of expertise is the Wars of the Roses in the Tudor period, early modern England, basically. I did my graduate work over at the University of Sheffield in England, and I had the privilege there to work under several noted and published historians in the field. I was able to be an assistant curator at a 16th century manor house, so I just ran into a lot of fortunate scenarios. And over my time there, I was able to meet great people, collect some really amazing stuff. So after this talk, you are more than welcome to come up, take a look at some of the artifacts that I brought with me today. Some of them are time period, or contemporary, I should say. There's a piece from Shakespeare's church. There's some Tudor badges. There's a tile that relates to one of our kings that we'll be talking about. So there's some connections there. So we can definitely chat about that. So I was asked to talk about the Wars of the Roses and Shakespeare, because Shakespeare wrote about the Wars of the Roses in several of his history plays. We have Henry VI, Part 1, 2, 3. We have, of course, Richard III. That's the big one that everybody's so familiar with. And with Richard's recent discovery at Leicester under the parking lot, The English love that so much, they just use all the jokes they can. He put the king in parking. It's just, it's the English. They have a particular type of humor. So, we're going to focus on those myths that Shakespeare did bring out, especially the Richard III one. So we'll touch on those as we go along. But I have to do it all within an hour. So the challenge has been accepted. So let's see what we can do. The first thing first, when I first got to teach my Shakespeare, my Wars of the Roses class, I got so excited I texted my wife and I said, guess what I'm doing? And she responded that way.
Oh, how cute.
So I gave her a literal, right, gave her a Shakespeare quote. So I'm a nerd, but that's okay.
That's great.
So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what are the Wars of the Roses? And the easiest way we can do it, the easiest way we can explain it, it's basically a series of battles and political conflict that occurred over a period of time in 15th century England. But it was mostly around the nobility. It had nothing, it wasn't a widespread conflict. It wasn't something that affected and ravaged all of England. That's something we'll actually be talking about. We as historians, we love to bookend things. So there's always got to be a nice start date and a nice end date. We don't like fiddly things. So the most commonly accepted dating that you're going to find is 1455 with the first battle, and 1485 with the Battle of Bosworth where Richard III is killed. It wasn't the last battle though. But that's the big one that we all remember. So therefore, 1485 is the end. The best way to put it is by Dan Jones. He is a really good historian. He writes in a public way, so the reading is really fun. And he has a best-selling book out called The Wars of the Roses, and it's at Barnes & Noble. You can get it through your friendly library as well, I'm sure. And he summed it up as, these are wars of politics and personality. And that comes through in Shakespeare's plays as well. We do have to consider, though, what was the main driving force behind the Wars of the Roses. It wasn't simply, I don't disagree with this house and this house, therefore we're going to take each other out. There's actually a vast amount of reasons, and it's not just one. If I had to pick one to really focus on, we'll look at kingship. But minority rule, in terms of what age the monarch has to be to rule on his own, that was an issue up for debate. Bastard feudalism, which is basically, I am going to wear the badge of my nobleman's house because he's paying me, I'm going to serve him. So basically the nobility built up their own miniature armies through retaining levies. So in return for paying them, giving them food, the levy would wear the badge and go fight for the nobleman. So it became known as bastard feudalism based on the medieval concept. Land grabs, I think you can look throughout history, land is always important. So that was a huge component. Economics, foreign policy, France coming back and winning the 100 Years' War, massive, massive blow to English prestige. We probably know of Shakespeare's play on Henry V. Of course, Agincourt, once more into the breach, my friends. Henry V destroys the French army at Agincourt, but that then gets squandered away by ineptitude from his son, Henry VI, and just by his counselors who were not really up for the job. And then we have lawlessness, just the inability for the monarch to enforce policy. So those are some of the main causes. The big one, though, that I just want to focus on briefly is kingship. Kingship is basically, I am the monarch, what I say goes. I am given the authority by God to rule over my people. And therefore, what I enact on, what I request needs to be done. It's basically absolute monarchy in a way. Magna Carta, though, tried to stop that in 1215. Magna Carta said the king is first amongst equals. You have to give consent to Parliament. You have to understand the will of the nobility and the people. So ever since 1215, kings have wrestled with their parliaments and their nobility about who had the true power. And it hits a turning point in the Wars of the Roses as well. That becomes a key issue. But For us modern folks, we look back at kingship and it's like, really, he just wore a crown. What makes him so special? Why does he get to have that power, that divine authority? But you can never look back on historical events with a modern mind because it's not going to make sense. It's not going to connect. And in the end, you're going to make false assumptions based on your modern preset of values. But if we go back, if we go into the archives and the illuminated manuscripts, we can get an idea of what kingship really meant. In these two cases, we have Henry III being crowned, and of course the young Henry VI. Vast, vast ceremonies, hours long. They get anointed with holy oils. They get the scepter and the orb, all components in this vast play that has to be enacted. But each part represents something. And it reinforces that they are the divine rulers, the holy oil especially. As soon as that was put on the monarch, he becomes God's chosen to rule. And if you dig into some of these sources, you can go through your library, you can go online, Google does some wonderful things every now and then. You can find some of these sources. For example, the Liber Regalis gives us Richard II's coronation, and you can read all about it. If you go into the letters and papers of Henry VIII, you can read about his coronation, and you can see what this elaborate ceremony was about. Westminster Abbey. This is the spot for coronations of the English monarch, most recently as 1952 with Elizabeth II. Vast, vast ceremony though. Even its location has symbolic meaning. So for those of you not familiar with Westminster Abbey, we are currently in the back end of the nave towards the choir and the altar. The altar, of course, we can tell this nice, lovely gold layout here. But underneath here, we have what's called the cosmati pavement, basically this elaborate mosaic that details the universe and everyone's place in the universe. That's a symbol of the king's power, planted right in the center. And behind this altar screen, we have the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor. Every monarch, medieval monarch for the most part, wanted to be buried around the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor. As close as you could be to him, the better, because you're now associated with a saint. You're associated with a saintly king of England. That meant something. So the location, the crowning ceremony, it all had to tie into the king's right to rule. But then we hit the Wars of the Roses. And with Henry VI, he was young, he wasn't as experienced, he favored counselors who weren't good at their job, and rivalries emerged. The king had no ability to stop them. He was weak in that sense. Henry VI was a fantastic scholar, a brilliant patron of the arts, but he was not the person to be king at that point in time. It was arguably the complete opposite. And that inability to enforce kingship caused a trickle-down where everything started to fall away. The king is the person who reinforces land grants. If the king doesn't have the ability to reinforce them, people are going to grab as much as they can and fight. Feuds erupted amongst the nobility. The king's job was to prevent that from happening. Couldn't do it. So all these dominoes started to fall, which led to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. So what I put here is the timeline. We have that typical period that historians love so much, 1455 to about 1485. I went a step further and added the last battle, because that's the bookend, in my opinion. But we also have a Cold War. So the hot areas where we had our battles, Towton, Tewkesbury, Bosworth, but we have these periods of political backstabbing, the Game of Thrones, if you will. People going back and forth. There were assassination attempts, people trying to imprison one another to get the king's ear, marriages, alliances, all sorts of crazy things happening during those periods. And even though we have a brand new monarchy, and 1485, where Richard III is killed and Henry Tudor starts the Tudor dynasty, famous for Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the Wars of the Roses never truly end until 1541, when the last Yorkists, the last of the White Rose, get executed. In this case, it was, I believe, a 68-year-old woman. because she had still that little bit of royal blood, that little bit of tie-in to the Yorkist rule, the king, Henry VIII at the time, was threatened, felt threatened. So she had to go. And for my argument point, that's where I kind of put the end of the Wars of the Roses. There's nothing left. You can't fight anymore. There's no one left. And I actually put that in there because it's true. It is true. That's actually how I recruited students for my course. I had said, this is the real Game of Thrones. It's what Game of Thrones is based on. The author said so much. So, the Wars of the Roses, how bad were they? 3 regional revolts. So, peasant uprisings. 1450, we have Cade's Rebellion, and in 89 and 97, we have pretenders, people claiming to be someone they're not. 13 battles, the big one, of course, being Towton. England's bloodiest battle. 30,000 plus dead in one afternoon at Towton. 1471 was the end of the Lancastrians. They were basically wiped off the map at that battle at Tewkesbury. 1485, Richard III falls at Bosworth. And 1487, the last battle of Stoke, where Henry VII reinforces his claim. 10 coups d'etats. 10. 15 invasions. Now, I'm not saying like D-Day invasion type invasion, but ones where what tended to happen in these early battles, the losing side would flee. They'd either flee to Ireland or they would flee to Brittany in France, gather their forces, and then come back. And so that happened 15 times between the different houses. The big one, though, is this: 5 usurpations. To remove a king from his throne was unheard of until 1399. Shakespeare again tells us of these with his plays on Richard II and Henry IV. Richard II, interesting king. He was the one right here. Richard II, interesting king. He showed promise early on, but over time, he became less stable. I'm not saying he was mentally unstable, but he just couldn't cope with some of the things that were going on. And he made one final mistake of removing one of his noblemen's rights to his lands. And that nobleman became the future Henry IV. So he invaded, kicked Richard II off the throne, and that opens the Pandora's box. That was the first time an English monarch is removed in that sense. So this whole divine authority has crumbled away. So when we get to the Wars of the Roses, it's now commonplace. No one bats an eye anymore. 1460, we have Henry VI gets deposed, or where are we here? Sorry, 1461. Yorkists take the throne at Towton. 1470, Henry VI is restored in the short-lived re-election. 1471, Edward IV reclaims what he just lost a year later. Doesn't end well for Henry VII, or Henry VI. 1483, we have Richard III taking the throne for himself from his nephews, the young princes in the Tower. So we'll be talking about that one. And then 1485, Henry Tudor removes Richard III. 5 kings in total: Henry VI, Edward IV, so Lancastrian, Yorkist, Tudor.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
As we go on?
Yeah, of course, by all means, everyone.
I noticed that there are 3 of the usurpations that match the dates of the 13 battles, 61, 71, 85. Are those just coincidental, or did one contribute to the other or assist the other?
Nope, you are absolutely correct. The battles, especially the later ones, tended to be penultimate battles, so the results were life and death, literally. In 1471, at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrians are wiped out. The Prince of Wales, who would be the heir, killed on the battlefield. Margaret Beaufort, the Queen, sent away. Henry VI is recaptured, put into the Tower of London, and is killed within a month. Murdered. Shakespeare says Richard III did it. Chances are, probably not. But it was under the Yorkist king, Edward IV, that happened. So it would have come from the monarch himself. But yes, very good question. So there are tyrants, and in other cases there were rebellions which didn't end in battles, but just instances of people getting fed up and trying to reestablish whichever house they supported. But with the Wars of the Roses, this whole conflict from 1455 to 1487, this whole hot period, and all of this that we just talked about, the total time that they spent fighting out of 32 years was between 13 weeks to 1 year. And here we go. So I've included these throughout the PowerPoint slide. It's like my Shakespeare myth stamp. So whenever we run into one of these, we're going to challenge a Shakespearean myth. So Shakespeare says that in the play Richard III, Henry VII at the end gives this grand speech about how he's going to reunite the houses because England was in such a sorry state, England tore itself apart, and yet we only really had 1 year of fighting. And we know that England didn't tear itself apart because we have primary sources. So this is a chronicler from the time period. And he actually said England enjoyed this peculiar mercy above all other kingdoms, that neither country nor the people nor the houses were destroyed or demolished. The real misfortunes of the war fell upon the nobility. So while we have this whole brutal tale of things happening, it was just the nobility, not the population at large. They just went about their business. Oh, who's the king today? Oh, great, okay. Awesome. You know, take one rose down, replace it with the other one. Things like that. But that's definitely a Shakespearean myth. The Wars of the Roses were not that brutal. And that's something where Shakespeare had such a grip that this concept, this whole new idea that it wasn't that bad, is just now starting to change. So if you read books from the 1920s, 1950s, even into the 1970s, you're going to get that the Wars of the Roses were an absolutely brutal conflict. But you start reading the newer ones, it's going to be completely different. Yes?
So can you contrast a little bit with like the English Civil War, for example? The English Civil War was perhaps a little bit more total war, a little bit
Yes.
more regionalized. This seems to have no real rhyme or reason in terms of geographical areas.
Correct. It definitely didn't. There were strongholds in different locations of the kingdom. So the Lancastrians had some strongholds up north. The Yorkists to the Welsh Marches, and they had London mostly. So there were regions of support, but in terms of the fighting itself, there was no, it's north versus south, east versus west, or anything like that. In the English Civil War, that was way more of a total war, where you were either supporting the monarchy or you were supporting Parliament, and there was no way around it. That century was just a time period of total war. If we look at the continental equivalent, the 30 Years' War, up to 25% of Germany's population was wiped out during the 30 Years' War. That was just war on a completely total scale. Civilians, soldiers, it didn't matter. Everyone gets slaughtered. But the Wars of the Roses was kind of this dying medieval age. Good point. So, we obviously cannot do all of this in an hour. It's impossible. The class that I teach is 15 classes, 3 hours at a time. So being able to do, or to break down just the cast of characters, it's impossible. It can't be done in an hour. But I did put this up here just to illustrate how we got to this point. So Edward III was King of England, and he reigned for a long time, all the way into 1377. That's fantastic. The problem is, one, if you reign too long, you're going to run into difficulties. Number two, it's great to have a lot of kids. Mortality was very high amongst infants, but if you have too many, you're going to run into a problem as well, in terms of people claiming their rights and what they deserve. So, another factor of the Wars of the Roses was the question, who has the right to rule? Who is next in line for the throne? Edward III, his first son, would have been the king, Edward, the Black Prince. But he died before Edward. Okay, so he's gone. He had a son, Richard II. And in that case, if male heirs are born to the first son, that is the line that continues. It doesn't, if Edward dies, and we do have a prince here, it doesn't go over. It just continues down this line now. It doesn't branch. So we have Richard II. All is well and good. The other sons, they're all busy. They have their family lines. They're going all over the place. And if you notice, we have John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third son, and Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. Lancaster and York. So Edward is dead. Richard II gets deposed. This line doesn't have a male. It ends with a female. Laws at the time said that the order in which the crown falls goes only through male lines. That has now changed. The English monarchy has switched it so that women can inherit. The Swedes were actually quite proactive, and in 1980, they switched over, and they had a prince first, and they switched it, so I don't know how he feels. But we have her. So we go then over one more to John of Gaunt, and there we have Henry IV. He deposes Richard II, and we have the Lancastrian line. And for a while, everything is good. Henry V restores glory to England, but then we have the inept Henry VI, who just couldn't maintain the necessary force that a king required. Over here, the Duke of York, his line grows here, and we have Richard of York. He marries Anne. So while Henry VI has the claim of direct male line, Richard says, wait a minute, I come from the fourth son, okay, I'm behind you, but I am connected to Anne Mortimer, to the second. So Richard Plantagenet, third Duke of York, he comes from this combination. And initially, to his credit, he's very loyal. He does everything he can for Henry VI. He fights for him in France, he pays out his own pocket, he does everything. He's loyal. But he gets shunned time and time again. Anytime he's supposed to get an award or get honored for what he's been doing, the court favorites, the Beauforts, push him out because they have a beef with him. They don't like him very much. And this political infighting and Henry's inability to stop it escalates into open war. And that's what leads to the start. Yes?
Was his marriage to Anne intentional on his part to establish some sort of claim?
Not at this point, because the third Earl of Cambridge married Anne Mortimer. This was when Henry V was the king, so there was no view there. But when Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York, he's born to that union, he then recognizes he has that claim.
Okay.
And in one particular case, Richard snaps. He's had enough of this. And he says, you know what? I have the right to rule. And he marches into the throne room and puts his hand on the throne and claims authority for himself. Although Parliament was very hushed about it, they didn't know what to do. So he walked out angrily. But that then leads on to the conflict. Of course, we can't really explore the details, but I highly recommend that Wars of the Roses book by Dan Jones. It will give you a fantastic overview of all of this. So this brings us, I wanted to just give us a quick idea of the battlefields and the armor and the weaponry and all of that. This is Towton. Towton, as I had mentioned, was the site of the bloodiest battle on English soil, with over 30,000 killed in a day of fighting. It actually occurred in a blizzard. And typical medieval tactics, usually, you had three sections. You had your center and your left and right flank. Archers in the front, spearmen, you had your cavalry on the flanks as well for maneuvers. But it was a pretty straightforward, charge together, let's bash some heads together. But they always start with what's called an arrow storm. So the English were famed for their longbow. It's how they beat the French again and again during the 100 Years' War. The composite of the wood, the yew that the English longbowman had in his bow, was a super weapon. It could fly farther, hit harder, and so we open up with an arrow storm from both sides, launching their arrows. The Lancastrians had to launch into the wind, and because it was a blizzard, they could not see, so the arrows fell short. The Yorkists fired their arrows in return, caused casualties. They say, oh look, there's arrows on the ground in front of us. Walk up, pick those up, and fire the arrows right back to the Lancastrians. So the Lancastrians have to give up their position. They had a better position. They had to give it up to charge and close because clearly they were not going to win the arrow storm competition. And that's where we get to close quarter fighting. Over time, just a series of combinations, the Lancastrian line breaks and they flee. They flee everywhere. They flee down this slope. The battle was fought on this plain here, and they flee down into this basin and into the river. They fled over the river. They're carrying heavy gear. A lot of men drowned. There's actually a place called the Bridge of Bodies because you could run over the river on the bodies of the dead. It just became a complete massacre.
Where is this roughly?
It is, I want to say it is about 30 minutes south of York, between Sheffield and York. So this is in the Midlands of England. Just an idea of, yes, yes, I actually do this as well, hence why I have part of my reenactment kit here. So we think of the late Middle Ages, full knights in armor on horseback. That wasn't the case anymore. Knights would actually fight dismounted for the most part, and they would fight with these massive weapons called a pole axe. Very, very brutal weapon. But there's a misnomer here that we think everybody's in armor. Only the rich, aka the nobility, were in armor. So the peasant, or the local person, the levy, they had to fight in what they had. And usually it was a padded jacket, stuffed with hay or straw or tow. And it provided some support. If you were really fancy, you can get some chainmail, or you can recover a helmet and some metal components off the dead. But that was the fighting style. Charge in and then start stabbing at each other with these long bill hooks. Farming tools they just implemented to warfare. Towton was absolutely brutal. Absolutely brutal. We have never seen this type of bloodshed in a Wars of the Roses battle. This was the first time that no quarter was expected nor given. And so at Towton, the archaeological finds really allow you to assess how the battle occurred, what the weapons could do. In this case, axe blows to the face, a pole axe most likely. But the interesting thing is, a lot of people had damage to the hands and to the back of the head. So the hands we can understand, well, if everyone's kind of standing in these lines, stabbing back and forth, you're obviously reaching out a little bit. Guess what gets hit first? Your hands. And then the back of the head, usually, or based on the evidence where they're found, the archaeologists can start making the assumptions that those were Lancastrians because they were fleeing and they get whacked from behind. That's where the cavalry came in. Because the cavalry would charge down the fleeing infantry and just spike them in the back of their heads. Because people are throwing their helmets off, they're trying to run as quickly as they can, and you run into the enemy. This is a perfect example of this right here. Perfect square, which is the tip of a raven's beak, right into the skull. And here we have another contemporary source. The dead bodies were seen to cover an area 6 miles long by 3 broad. Of course, medieval chroniclers love to over-exaggerate, but given the Towton casualty amount, there's some truth to that. So, that's the Wars of the Roses in a 30-minute nutshell. Definitely plenty more to explore and talk about, so I highly recommend you dig further if that is of interest to you. But where does Shakespeare come in? That's the whole reason we're here, right? It's about Shakespeare's folio. So, what I wanted to do is look at those plays and dispel some of the myths that we might have grown up around in regards to Shakespeare and these history plays. So, Shakespeare has given us several. Henry VI, Part 1, 2, and 3. Richard III, being the predominant Wars of the Roses ones. First thing we have to keep in mind, as historians, who are all historians right now as well with me, we have to keep in mind source bias. So Shakespeare is writing towards the end of the 16th century. Okay? At that point in time, we have the last Tudor, Elizabeth I, good Queen Bess for some people, on the throne. She's a Tudor. You are not going to make the Tudors look bad, right? Elizabeth loved Shakespeare's plays. She attended some of them or had some of them performed in the palaces. So you're not going to write history plays that make the Tudor dynasty look bad. And it was the Tudors, Henry VII, who kills Richard III at Bosworth and starts the Tudor dynasty. That's what ends the Wars of the Roses. It's the Tudors taking over. The Tudors emerge as this last-ditch gasp of the Lancastrian line, a very off relation from the Lancastrians. So the first thing, etymology, the Wars of the Roses. Who came up with that? The English didn't have a name for the Wars of the Roses at that point in time. It was called, the Quarrel of the Two Roses, or the Union of the Houses of Lancaster and York. They weren't so much interested in the conflict, whereas the final end product. It wasn't until 1646 that the Roses get involved. And it's not until 1829 where we got Sir Walter Scott coming in, famous for Ivanhoe, that great Scottish poet and historian and archaeologist, and he's basically done everything. But he's the one who coins the term Wars of the Roses, and that name has stuck. Recently, though, in the 2000s, we have this new thing coming in called the Cousins War. I do not like it. I do not like it one bit. That comes to us from Philippa Gregory.
Yes.
She does historical fiction. And while she writes great historical fiction, I'm not so much a fan of her messing with the history, especially when it starts to catch on. So that's just my bias. I prefer the Wars of the Roses. But here's our next stamp, the Shakespeare myth. Since 1485, when Henry Tudor claims the throne, we have the juxtaposition of white versus red. That's finally Lancaster, York. York always had the white rose.